Hey y'all, here are my top 3 tips for starting to get around by transit if you're used to driving.
Before we get into it, I want to call out that there were a lot of pretty basic practical tips that people mentioned in the comments on my last transit video. Things like use an app for route navigation. I'll put a list of some of those up on the screen now, and these are definitely good tips for people just starting out, but I don't think there's really a whole lot for me personally to say about them that you couldn't find in more detail with a Google search or from just trying it out in the real world.
So with that in mind, the following 3 tips are all going to be a little bigger picture and more about expectations, mindset, and generally speaking, adjusting to a non-car centric lifestyle. Alright, let's get into it. Number 1, use the bus. This is the most straightforward of the 3, and it feels a little weird that I have to say it at all, but very often when people who don't use transit talk about transit, they have a kind of tunnel vision for rail. And I totally get it. Light rail, subway, streetcars.
Rail is cool, exciting, dare I say, sexy, and rail projects do very often have a lot of concrete benefits over bus lines.
It's not hard to understand why new rail projects capture public interest and awareness in a way that bus lines never will. Buses can be kind of grungy. They can be bumpy or crowded, and the stops aren't nearly as slick. Aesthetically, buses are usually a big step down from rail, and that might seem like a silly, trivial thing to say, but for people who are used to getting around in personal, climate-controlled metal boxes in a pathologically individualistic society that constantly glorifies the aesthetics of wealth, this is a real mental barrier, which is why this is my first tip.
If you talk about wanting to use transit, but you are also ignoring your city's bus network, stop. The point of transit is not to be aesthetic, it's to get people where they need to go. And in most cities around the world, bus networks are much more expansive than rail. Whatever hangups you might have about using the bus, work them out. Do some introspection. Reflect on how car culture has warped your expectations for what navigating society should look like. Of course, we all want shiny new infrastructure, but if you're actually interested in using transit, you're always going to have to work with what you've got. And for a lot of trips, that's going to be buses, not rail.
Alright, number 2, get used to schedules.
As much as I hate to say it, one convenient thing about driving is that it is a personal mode of transportation.
Like walking or biking or scooting. And what this means is that you get to make trips on your schedule. Of course, you also have to account for everyone else's schedule in the form of traffic, but when you leave, when you return, and how much of a buffer you give yourself are all up to you. With public transit, this is not quite the case, since you also have to think about the schedule and frequency of the service you're going to be using.
And you'll have a much easier time if you adjust your expectations accordingly.
Maybe you're dealing with a bus line that doesn't have great frequency and only comes every 30 minutes. And when you look at transit directions, it says that you just missed one, so you've got to wait a whole nother half hour. Now, if your expectation is that you should be able to leave and start your trip whenever you want, you might think this means that transit isn't a viable option for this trip, and you might decide to just take your car instead. Or you could just wait and leave in 25 minutes. Throw on an episode of something, do some dishes, whatever. Maybe this won't always be feasible, but try to recognize when your perceived need to leave right away is actually a need, and when it's just an expectation that you've developed because you're used to driving everywhere. When you're working with schedules, there are a lot of steps you can take to make things a lot easier on yourself. Things like checking the schedule for your route ahead of time if you're unfamiliar with it. If you're taking a longer trip that has a more complicated schedule, maybe try to combine it with other things you want to do in that same area. If you're going out late, make sure you check the last departure times for your trip back, and maybe have a contingency plan like a ride share or crashing with a friend in case you decide to stay out later than that. Of course, we all want better service hours and frequencies, but at the end of the day, public transit is just that, public. If you're trying to plan around it like it's private, the best transit networks in the world will probably not satisfy you.
Alright, finally, number 3, and in my opinion, the most important tip on this list, Try to stop stressing about trips.
In the comments on my last transit vid, a lot of people left comments pointing out that even though I was able to make the featured trips via transit in under an hour, they would have been faster via car. And while I could point out that all of those people were assuming a mythical total absence of traffic, it's kind of beside the point because I honestly don't care. Driving sucks. Now I realize that this might sound like me just being opinionated, but it's really not. It is a very real, easily observable, culture-wide phenomenon. People talk about how driving sucks like they talk about the weather. Traffic, parking, other drivers, maintenance, the list goes on. But car culture is so normalized that people view these things as unfortunate, isolated, random inconveniences instead of what they are, which is an unavoidable part of driving. There is no version of a car-centric society at scale where these problems don't exist. Cars effectively take societal transportation and turn it from this into this. And then everyone is forced to try to solve that puzzle as fast as they can with thousands of dollars and literal lives on the line. It is inherently stressful. Hell, we even have a term specifically for the common occurrence of people literally buckling under this stress and violently lashing out at those around them. Road rage does not refer to cyclists or pedestrians or people who ride transit because none of those ways of getting around lead to predictable psychological breaks. Driving does. All this to say, if you're starting to get around via transit and you're seeing estimated trip times that are longer than they might be via driving, keep in mind that even if the trip takes longer, it will be drastically less mentally taxing. Driving requires constant active engagement. Transit does not. Once you get used to it, getting around via transit is really just a mix of hanging out and going for a walk. How much time per day do you spend scrolling, reading, catching up on messages? How about just sitting with your thoughts and zoning out for a bit? Trying to do any of these things while driving might get you killed, but on transit, you're free to relax in whatever way you want because someone else is doing the driving for you. And making transfers or going the final stretch from a stop on foot is just a nice little walk for your mental health that you might not take at all otherwise. Now, obviously, there are times where getting somewhere quicker is necessary or desirable, but with a non-car-centric lifestyle, you can start to make those times the exception rather than the rule. Your mental health will thank you for it. Alright y'all, that is all I've got for you right now. This was a long video, so if you stuck around till the end, thanks, and let me know in the comments if there are other things you'd like to hear me talk about.